there, this is Miss Rachel with the Lorain Public Library System, and this is part 2 of our 4-part series about making comics. So in this part we're going to be talking about characters, and characters are awesome because they can be absolutely anything. So they can be a rock, a little pigeon on the street, a magical cat wizard high in his tower, or just an ordinary person. So a character can be anything. So the advice that I'm giving might not all apply to the character that you're making. It may or may not. But these are general things that are really good to think about when you're making a character for a story. In particular, what you want them to look like and how you'd like to draw them.
So when talking about characters, a great place to start is the face. Faces usually are the most important part of a character. It's what we focus on and how we know it's somebody specific. Sometimes it's the only thing we can see when we're reading a comic. What's cool about humans is that we see faces in everything, and we give human-like qualities to both objects and animals. So really anything can be turned into a face. We see faces so often that we're even able to see that a circle, 2 dots, and a little line make a face. So it's pretty cool. So if you're planning on sticking to drawing stick figures, that works completely fine because people will know that you're drawing a person. But of course, if you want to go a bit further than a smiley face, you want to do something more complex, you can always begin adding more details like noses, ears, and much, much more. Just remember that the more details you add, the more specific the character will be. They'll be a particular person. Sometimes, instead, you want a character to be anybody or someone that's relatable. So sometimes going with a stick figure might actually be the better pick. Try making faces out of more than just circles too. You can use squares, half circles, ovals, go crazy. People have many different face shapes, and the more you experiment and try new things, something inspiring or fun may just turn up. So next we'll move on to facial expressions. So these are the main way we can tell the emotion of a character or know how someone is feeling in real life. If they're smiling, they're happy, and if they're frowning, they're sad. Same goes for other expressions like anger, laughter, an unemotional face, kind of neutral, plus many more. You can actually combine facial expressions together to make something more complex, kind of like face math, which is a really weird concept, but when you really think about it, it's just adding at least 2 facial expressions together to make a whole new one. You can also add them at different amounts, so maybe it's only a quarter sad and 3/4 angry instead of just half and half. Take, for instance, a parent at their child's graduation. They're super happy because it's a very proud moment, but they also know it marks the end of childhood. Their child isn't going to have as much time to spend with them anymore because they're moving on to their adult life. So it's a pretty bittersweet moment. The way we actually make facial expressions is that our muscles squish into different positions, and that's how we can tell how other people are feeling. In our comic, we can either make these expressions really over the top, or they can be more simple and subtle. Another cool thing about comics is that expressions can have these little symbols and lines to help show how a character is feeling. These are called emanata. They can show if someone's surprised, angry, confused, stressed, crying, and much more. Emanata don't exist in real life. That would be really cool if they did, but they're really just exaggerations on how someone is feeling in a symbolic form. Some emanata are regional, so you're more likely to find some in manga versus other comics. So sometimes you don't know what a particular expression or face might look like, so usually the best thing to do is to look at the people around you or just simply look in a mirror. That way you can simplify the shapes that you see and be able to draw a lot of different types of face shapes and expressions. Sometimes it looks really silly to do, and it might feel a little bit weird at first, but a lot of artists do this, and it can be a very easy and cost-efficient way in order to get a lot of reference. So from the face, we move on to work on poses. So poses don't just show what a character is doing, it can also show emotion. So when facial expressions don't tell how someone's feeling, maybe they're bottling it up a little bit inside, someone's pose will be the next thing that you notice. Say for instance someone's smiling, they're so happy, but you also see that they're slumped over and tired from working in their garden. They're happy because they got a lot of work done, their garden looks beautiful, but they're also exhausted, so you wouldn't necessarily see that from just the face alone. Poses for characters can either be dynamic or static. Static means that they aren't really moving, like when someone's maybe standing or sitting. They have less motion, but some comics focus on the small moments or other details like this. Dynamic poses, on the other hand, are the kinds that you're likely to find in superhero comics. They involve more action, are more exciting, and change the feeling you get while reading completely. For instance, Spiderman is much more dynamic when swinging on a web than he is just pointing at a bad guy. And then there are poses that are completely in between. Usually it's good to have a variety of both static and dynamic poses, but that is completely up to you. Another thing you can do to add more interest to your drawings, especially with characters, is squash and stretch. So this is a concept used in both cartooning and animation. So when you're thinking of a good example, think of the old Mickey Mouse cartoons. So you're taking a simple shape, squashing it all which way like you would putty, and you can use this for both faces and poses. So some artists use something called the line of action, and this essentially represents where the spine would be, or the general gesture of what the pose is. So this is usually a single line, and then they start to add other main points of the body, like the shoulders or the hips, to kind of show where each part of the body is. This can help make a pose a little bit more natural. Obviously with this example, it's a lot more simple, but then you can start to lay your basic shapes for the body over it and then start to add detail after that.
So you might be saying to yourself, a face, little 2 dots, a little mouth, a little smiley face. I have that down pat, no worries. But I don't know so much about poses with hands, arms, legs. That's a little outside my comfort zone. Well, I have good news for you. I have some tips that'll make drawing people just a little less scary.
First of all, stick figures and other simple characters are still great to use. They're universal, and a lot of successful comics have used either stick figures, stick people, or just other simple characters. So if you want to stick to stick figures, that will work perfectly well. Like faces, people's bodies can be broken down into many different types of simple shapes, like circles, ovals, and rectangles. You can outline the shape first, and then worry about the details later. Same works for hands and feet, which can be broken up into rectangles and ovals. Sometimes drawing lines for position first will help before putting down the shapes and then the details that you'll put in later. If you ever get more comfortable with simple shapes, you can also try converting those to 3D shapes like spheres, cylinders, and cubes. So you can use some of these 3D shapes in order to build your character and then give them more depth. Using many different shapes will help you to create many different types of characters. Make arms long, heads big, hands small. Try and experiment. Not one person looks the same in real life, and you can create some fun and unique characters this way. If you're not interested in drawing people, but instead want to draw animals, they're going to work the exact same way. Just take what you see and simplify it into broken down shapes. Of course, stick cats and dogs will work just fine too. Readers will completely understand what you're trying to draw. Just like faces, reference from life or pictures is a good way to see what a pose looks like. Posing in front of a mirror or camera will help you to see how a certain pose will look if you can't find a picture that shows the same thing. Again, it kind of looks silly when you do it, but it really helps when you're stuck, and it's kind of fun to do too. So now that we know what makes up a character, we can start talking more about the story-driven and visual elements of the design of a character. Just remember that these are just ideas and some tips and tricks that you can apply to your characters if you'd like to. There are no hard, fast rules with comics, so if you're in a rut and want some ideas to move forward, or you don't know where to start at all, these are some things you might want to think about when designing your characters. Just like stories, you can use a mind map or a mood board in order to brainstorm some ideas about your character. So maybe there's a certain ideas that grab you, like magic, or maybe cats in this particular example, and you can explore the different character traits that you might get from some of those ideas. When making characters, it's best to use what you know, or what you'd like to learn more about. For instance, I'm taking inspiration from my cat to make my comic character. In this instance, you could call him my muse. This is a horrible joke, but there was no way I wasn't going to base my character off this little guy. I mean, look at him, he's so cute. Cute cats aside, let's get back to the main program. Let's say, for instance, you like to fish, your favorite color is green, and you like watching NASCAR. There are a couple characters that we can make from just these three things. One example could be a fisherman who dreams of driving a NASCAR and winning the big races, and he wants to drive a green car specifically. In another example, you could have a woman who is the best NASCAR driver in the whole world, but then she gets in an accident and spends the rest of her days fishing out on the open sea. What am I going to do with the color green? Well, maybe she's green with envy because she can't race anymore. Or you could go completely random and have a character that's an alien who's green, who rides in a NASCAR vehicle out in space, fishing for space fish. You could get pretty weird with it. In most comics, there's going to be more than one character, so think about adding friends, enemies, or background characters. The more important the character, the more details they'll need. And for background characters, they don't really need any detail at all unless you want to give them some. With comics, keep in mind that you'll be drawing the same things over and over and over again. It's good to stick to something that's easier to draw, isn't too detailed, and is easy to see on the page. If your character needs more details, like they have a lot of buttons on their shirt, have different versions based on how close up you see them. You might not always see every button on their shirt, except for when you can close up. So body shapes are another thing that you can use to give an idea of what your character is like. Squares might imply strength or boldness, while circles might make someone seem more friendly. There's a lot of unconscious things we think about shapes and how they make us feel, so you can use that to your advantage when designing your character. You can also use the quality of your line and choice of colors to help develop your character design. What do they say about your character? Are they harsh or smooth? Is it an intense color or a softer one? You can also avoid line kind of altogether by creating a sort of lineless style. So using color, value, and texture, You can use the difference between dark and light values in order to create depth. You can still add line for details, but this way it kind of looks like it doesn't have any lines, which is pretty cool. You can also design your character with opposites in mind. Maybe give them opposite characteristics to make your character a little bit unexpected, like a vampire that loves puppies rather than eating them. You could do the same with colors, shapes, anything like that. So maybe you perceive a certain character to be a certain way, but it turns out they're very, very different. Sometimes that can be super fun. A strong silhouette can help make your character unique and be recognizable. The silhouette is the outline of your character. So think, does it have a certain shape to make it stand out? Can I only tell it's that character and that character alone? Is it more organic or mechanical in nature? If you take a look at some of these silhouettes, can you tell what characters they are? You might be able to because they have a strong silhouette. Sometimes it's good to have each detail in clothing your character wears to have a specific purpose. It's easy to go overboard with a design, and then all the cool details don't really tell us much about the character. There are a lot of ways that you can make your character distinct or unique. This can include physical features like maybe a scar or an interesting tattoo, clothing or their sense of fashion, hairstyle or hair color, poses and the way they move, or even facial expressions. Once you get an idea of what your character looks like, what your character acts like, you can start to outline your character. So make some sketches of what you think they might look like, and also make a list of some of their likes and dislikes, their attitude, or anything else important that makes that character unique. Remember that it's okay if details change over time, especially if you're working on your story a bit more first over your character, or maybe you're working on your character first and then start to work on your story more. So depending on what order you start things in, the details might change over time. If you're not sure how to break down a character into details like this, take a look at a character maybe you're more familiar with. Break them down into what they like and they don't like. Maybe some of their design choices, colors, or line that the artist uses. Maybe some of their unique traits. You can break those down and kind of see what the writer and the artist was doing when they were trying to make that character. As you make your character, just be prepared to make changes even over time. You may notice in some cartoons and comics the design of a character changes or the style is different in later seasons. If the professionals do it, this is perfectly fine if it happens in your comic too. So the last piece of advice that I can give in regards to characters is creating a character turnaround. So a character turnaround is a reference tool and helps keep your character on model or consistent for the time that you're drawing them. So to do this, all you need is to draw out your character from the front, back, and side views. You can add more views like the quarter view, overhead, angled, anything that helps you with understanding the design of your character. You can also add any of their accessories, clothing, poses, expressions, and any kind of notes that you'd like to keep. For my character turnaround, I wanted to include one fully colored version and then just a couple of views that I would use throughout the comic. I really didn't want to get too complicated with it, so I kept it pretty simple. Lastly, I added a couple of different expressions my character will have, as well as some details like his little bow and his paws.
So this concludes part 2 of our 4-part series about making comics. So today we talked all about characters, and next time we are talking about what I call the actually making the comic. So that includes all the panels, speech bubbles, sound effects, and all those fun things. So until we meet again, see you next time!